Well, ahead of the President's address, we ask, is South Africa out of the woods? Over 6 million South Africans have now received at least one dose of the coronavirus vaccine, and there's been a steady decline in infections in the last week. The Co-Chairperson of the Ministerial Advisory Committee on COVID-19, Professor Koleka Mlisana, joins me now for this update. Prof, always a pleasure speaking to you. A very good evening to you. Let's talk a little bit whether or not South Africa is indeed out of the woods. Now, on Friday, we saw the Acting Minister of Health say that we may just have passed the COVID-19 third wave. Can we really say that is so, especially in light of what has indeed happened over the past 2 weeks, where we saw looting, protests, and of course no adherence to COVID-19 regulations? And we all know that when it comes to testing, most of the tests are a coagulation that have happened over a period of time now.
Hi, good evening, Faith, and good evening to all the viewers. Thank you for having me. Yes. Actually, really, I think what the minister was saying is that we have passed the peak of the wave. Because, I mean, if you're looking at where things are at right now, as you correctly highlight, we have been seeing a decline in the number of cases. I mean, I remember during the peak, in fact, if one just quickly compares the third wave peak to the second wave peak, the third wave peak, we reached it around, I think it was the 4th of July, and on that particular day, we had 19,956 cases. And if we compare this to the second wave peak, we had 19,000, just over 19,042 cases. So we have been seeing a slow decline. So if one looks at that 19,956 we saw beginning of July, as of today, of yesterday, we really had 12,000 cases. So you can see that there has been a steady decline. We are not over the woods, yet, because, as you correctly say, what we saw happening recently with the unrest in Gauteng and KZN, there was a definite impact, a negative one, on testing. In that, for instance, in KZN, we saw this sharp decline in testing. But what also is good is that really in the last 2 to 3 days, we have seen the increase going back to similar figures that we're seeing before the unrest. Yeah. So one then looks at the number of cases that we're seeing, how are we performing insofar as testing is concerned. So the decline has been steady with the cases. But what also we must not forget is that the hospitalizations were still seeing an increase in hospitalizations. If, for instance, one can just look at the exact figures, really, we know now that if we're looking at cases, there has been, using the 7-day, moving average, a 22% decline on the cases as of data that we got yesterday. But if we're looking at hospitalization, there still is an increase of 0.6%. It is much lower than what we had been seeing before, but also the deaths continue to increase, and we still are seeing almost 3% increases in deaths. So we are not out of the woods, but there has been a definite shift. So it's a matter of then watching to see, especially for the provinces that were still, are still on the increase. I mean, Gauteng now only contributes 30% of the new cases, but we have seen an increase in the Western Cape, where Western Cape is sitting at about 21% of the cases, and KZN is also now looking, coming up with 14% of the number of cases. So all of these still need to be watched very closely.
Well, Prof, then can we safely say that the actual figures that we get on a daily basis is an accurate indication of what's happening on the ground? And this is coming from the back of even the Department of Health that expressed concern about how people may be reluctant to go and test. They may have COVID, but they won't test simply because of the contact tracing mechanism. So when I have to get into my contacts and trace them, should I be found out that I was indeed part of the protest, that is something I don't want, in my name. So when it comes to being able to provide an accurate account of what the country is going through in terms of COVID-19, can we safely say that right now what we're seeing is an accurate indication of the realities in South Africa?
Well, the truth of the matter, Faith, actually, is that we can never say accurately, because, I mean, even apart from everything else that you have mentioned, which you are correct in, we must not forget that the majority of cases who actually have got COVID are asymptomatic. So there's a big percentage of the population that never even gets to testing, whether they are unrest or no unrest. So that's the first thing. And then secondly, the point that you're making, we are only really looking at the numbers that are presenting for testing. And as you correctly say, after seeing what was happening, the crowds that we saw during unrest with no non-pharmaceutical interventions being used whatsoever. So we are expecting, especially in the backdrop of the Delta variant, which is highly transmissible. So we really would expect that then there would have been, those would have created, like the super spreader events. So, but at the end of the day, we can only really respond to the numbers that are coming in and presenting for testing. But we have been concerned that there may actually be a lot more infections wherein people might be reluctant to come up for testing. But like I was saying earlier on, if whoever comes up for testing, it is anything to go by. We are seeing the numbers going back to the numbers that we're seeing before the unrest. And so for us, then we can use that and say, then, the testing, even though we saw the decline, now it might actually be going back to what was before.
Yeah, and with that decline then, Professor, does that mean it is safe enough for the country to ease certain restrictions that we have now and that we're seeing on level 4 of the lockdown? Would you advise that perhaps we go back to maybe level 3 or 2 and maybe even open up the country a little bit further to allow for economic participation?
Obviously, we have to look at a lot more, factors than just the decline in the cases. So there's the decline which we've already talked about, but also what we have seen is, the reproductive number, which actually tells us how much transmission is happening. So we have seen it declining, and in fact, in most provinces now, it is below 1. And what that tells us is that therefore there's a reduction in transmission. So we expect that trend to continue going down. So that's another good, indicator. And then the third issue as well is the fact that, now we're seeing, vaccinations, ramping up. Obviously, we're still a lot, way behind, but at least just the fact that now we're getting a lot more people, getting at least the first, a dose is another pointer towards the correct direction. So really, we look at all of those, and there's always the debate of, when do we then open up, because we're worried about the economic, status of the country versus the number of infections that are happening. So really, we need to look at that, but at least it looks like we might be a little bit, out of the woods, but we still need to be very careful.
Prof, I hear you. Just to interject there, I hear you, but you're still not saying, does that mean it is safe enough to ease lockdown restrictions? Can we say we can ease, maybe go to level 3 or even to level 2 if you were to advise the president on that? Would you say, Mr. President, we can go to level 3 now?
Really, looking at the factors that I've already mentioned, we really think it is, we can actually confidently ease the restrictions. But at the same time, we'll leave it to the president as to how far he wants to bring it down. But really, there's already enough evidence that we are on the, coming down.
Gotcha.
And there's no reason to believe we might actually have see a turnaround and see a lot more increasing infections.
Professor, always a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time this evening. Professor Koleka Mlisana, Co-Chairperson of the Ministerial Advisory Committee on COVID-19, saying, look, it may just be that we can actually afford to ease lockdown restrictions. How and to what level? Well, that is to the discretion of the president. Well, still ahead for you this evening.